everyone. My name is Sunita Puri, and I will be moderating a very wonderful session with three close colleagues of mine called Shedding Light, Vanquishing Fear, End-of-Life Planning with the Experts. Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. Joan Didion's words from The Year of Magical Thinking encapsulate the experience that many people feel when they describe changes in their own health or the loss, often unexpected, of someone they love. And yet, although great writers throughout time have found the language to portray what loss and grief and facing mortality feel like, having discussions around these very topics remains elusive in the United States, and I would say even abroad. The writers on this panel have been on the forefront of instructing people, members of the public, as well as physicians, in how to acknowledge the universality and importance of mortality, and also how to talk about it. We are living in a time when the work of Dr. B.J. Miller, Shoshana Berger, and Katy Butler is more important than ever. Dr. B.J. Miller was actually the inspiration for me to pursue a career in palliative medicine, and he has been on the forefront of advancing this field, which attends to suffering in all its forms of both patients, families, and even physicians who are dealing with someone living with a serious illness. He and Shoshana Berger have authored A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. Katy Butler is the author of two books, Knocking on Heaven's Door, and her most recent book is The Art of Dying Well. Her first book, Knocking on Heaven's Door, was a New York Times notable book. She has received multiple awards for her journalism and for her long-form writing, and she is a dear friend and mentor to me, the person who convinced me that I too could be a writer. I'm forever grateful to all of the people on this panel, not only for how they've changed my life, but how their work already has and will continue to change the lives of so many by helping us to face one of the most universal human experiences, that we all will die, that we all will suffer. But their words are the salve to that particular experience that all of us will face. I want to start the panel by reading a short excerpt from Katy Butler's The Art of Dying Well. There is a way to a peaceful, empowered, humane death, even in the era of high-tech medicine. It begins long before the final panicked trip to the ER. It requires navigation over years, not days, amid a system poorly structured to meet the needs of aging people and people of any age coping with a prolonged or incurable illness. So I'll start off with Katy. Can you talk about what inspired you to write this guide, which takes people through not only the experience of mortality, but all of the years preceding it, particularly the elderly? What inspired you to write this guide and to call it a sort of navigation?
I think, first of all, I'd written one book which was about my father's very protracted process through the end of life, which my family came to feel toward the end had been unduly prolonged because he'd been given a pacemaker with no discussion of its meaning its meaning to us as a family. And in a way, that book was a bit of a complaint. It was a description of what's wrong with American medicine in its failure to grapple with the reality of death, and therefore creating unnecessary suffering on the way to death, because I think we're all going to suffer. But the unnecessary part of it just really got under my skin. And then I turned 70 myself, and I realized we really needed a map to what a good end of life could look like, dealing with a system that's really not set up to provide it. So it was really a how-to book in a way, partly for me, And partly it was like, okay, you've written about the problem. Now, what about the solutions? What about the workarounds? There's not going to be one magic bullet that's going to solve all this. But there are so many little ways that you can improve things. And I had created a Facebook group called Slow Medicine, which now has 6,000 members, many of whom are in medicine, but many of whom are not, caregivers like me and like Shoshana. And there's been so much interesting cross-fertilization there and stories told. And so I got all these like little tips and stuff. And I just wanted to sort of consolidate them and make sure they really got shared. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And Shoshana and BJ, you've written a really fantastic step-by-step book to help people navigate what is often experienced as the chaos of end-of-life planning, of talking about choices, of talking to children about how sick their parent is. And you go all the way through that into things like how to plan your funeral, how to sign up for hospice, does insurance cover hospice? And you did so in a way that incorporated information and stories, which was really lovely. My question to you is, what gap were you looking to fill in writing this book?
Well, I can jump in. I think it's amazing to me that every parent gets a guidebook. Like 90% of pregnant women read What to Expect When You're Expecting. And yet there was absolutely no playbook for the other end of life. And I, like Katy, went through a very protracted death with my father having dementia and felt just woefully unprepared for the experience. And here I'm a, college-educated person. I have a supportive family. I have every privilege you can imagine. And yet we were thrown into so much chaos and anxiety and distress and really had no idea how to navigate. So the gap we were trying to fill was to give people really a stepwise kind of calm and comforting approach. That we wanted to write the book in the tone of getting an email from a good friend who says, look, here's what I did. Or this was my experience. Maybe this will help you. And have it just feel approachable and accessible and not like a textbook.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to throw something in here, which is I wrote my book thinking I and most of the people I knew were going to suffer or not suffer, experience long, slow, gradual declines. And that's why my book is divided into these health stages. There's resilient, young old age, and then there's starting to crumble, and there's crumbling a little more. And at each of those stages, it makes sense to shift your attitude toward medicine. What can it do for me? What can it not do for me? And what are the risks it was going to actually put me through that might actually make my experience worse rather than better? Because if we don't readjust our expectations and limit them, we are in for being on this conveyor belt to a highly technological, highly medicalized death.
Yeah.
But then this epidemic hit, this pandemic hit, and suddenly choices that I thought I and people I know might have years to gradually come to terms with suddenly might be decisions that need to be made in days or weeks. It's a very interesting confrontation for me with my own vulnerability and mortality, because I'm 70 and almost everybody who's died has been over 60. On the other hand, I'm really healthy. I don't have a liver problem or a heart problem. So where do I stand now? It's not as clear as it was when I wrote my book. I think I'm going to have to write like a PDF to send people or something to address this new situation.
Yep. And BJ, I want to turn to you both kind of to hear why you wrote this book, but also to reflect on something Katy said, which is that people have certain expectations of medicine, right? Mm-hmm. And you use this phrase, Katy, where do I stand in this epidemic? My experience as a palliative care doctor has been that I have to manage expectations of people, both sometimes patients and families, but also of my colleagues. Mm-hmm. And as much, I want to hear your thoughts on why you wrote this book, but I'm also interested in your reflections on people's expectations of medicine, your own expectations of medicine, and when they started to turn, what pushed you into palliative care? What led you to palliative care? Mm-hmm. A lot of questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. So I mean, I think the first one's kind of easy to answer. I think that Katy, Shoshana, and I are of a piece here. I think one answer is I wrote this book with Shoshana because she asked, and this idea of working with Shosh for a few years was just a wonderful idea. And then two, like Katy's pointing to, both Shoshana and I were aware and had marinated together on this notion that, yeah, life's hard, death's hard. Okay, fine. That's something we all share. That's a common bond. But there's this uncommon added thing that Katy pointed to, an unnecessary suffering, or sometimes it feels like gratuitous suffering. I mean, almost it can feel cruel. Like we have these systems that knowing people have designed that do not accommodate so much of our reality. And there's such a tension there. So we all wanted to sort of honor the very full experience that death brings to our table and reassure folks that, hey, you're going to get through it. This is a natural phenomenon. You're being natural. You're nature here. It's okay. De-shame it. I mean, a lot of reassurance, but then also lean into where in modern times, thanks to our healthcare system, it's gotten spectacularly unintuitive, and we've gotten removed from this piece of our nature and other pieces of our nature. So the idea was to close that gap. In other words, basically, dying had gotten harder than it needed to be.
Yeah.
And the ways in which it had gotten harder, at least in our Western society, were pretty predictable. There's a lot of pattern recognition. All of us on this conversation see it all the time. And a lot of people are suffering for just a lack of some very basic information, or some very basic support. This is not exotic or esoteric stuff. It's just not. It's been hard to find the information when you need it. So that's a gap that Shoshana and I we're trying to step into. And it sounds like Katy too. We're all seeing much the same reality. So that's that answer. And then, your point about expectations, huge, Sunita. So that's where that's one of the ways we suffer so much. There's this reference point. Sometimes it's opaque. You can't see it. You don't know what you're being compared to, but you know you're off from some standard. And, medicine, this is where medicine shines. It holds this idea of a healthy, normal person. And if you're close to that center, medicine has a lot to offer you. And if you fall from that center in a way that's fixable, medicine has a lot to offer you. The acute sort of response to something traumatic, ICUs, ERs. This is where acute care medicine does very well. It's spectacularly well in some ways. I mean, I'm living proof of that. I'm alive thanks to medicine. But if you get farther and farther from that mythical normal person, then medicine has less and less to offer you. So whether that's just happening by virtue of aging or by illness or by choice, you start to come into terms with medicine's purview doesn't cover everybody and doesn't cover every aspect of any one person. Yeah. And that's fine. Medicine doesn't have to be everything, but boy, medicine sort of branded itself to be everything. And while churches and families and other structures of support have dissolved a little bit, medicine has become the church, has become the family as we go to the ER for all our troubles. Yeah. So on one hand, darn it, medicine, you really overextended your marketing reach. Like where I did my internship in Milwaukee, Sunita, you'll appreciate this. The tagline of the hospital was where miracles happen every day. Oh. And I was like, I hated walking into that building. Because your point, what a ridiculous expectation of us little mortals. So anyway, that's that. I don't know where I was going, except to say that medicine. Part of the problem is medicine has overreached its marketing, and its own arrogance to some degree has And we also, part of it is, there's a collusion with the public. We patients want our doctors to be, expect them to be. So there's a little dance here. There's an indictment on the health system for sure. That's an invention. We should know better. And then there's also a piece of this puzzle here that we on the public have to stop looking for external answers when there's something in us that needs addressing.
That's wonderful. And I think, one thing that came to mind when you were talking is it's the expectations that people have of medicine. And it's also the expectations that doctors and nurses might have of themselves, that we are charged with saving lives, no matter what those lives might actually look like once we've saved them. And particularly in the stages of chronic illness and aging that you described so nicely, Katy, I want to hear your reflections on what you wish your doctors for yourself and for your father had done differently, because there was so much of a savior complex that many of them had, and this discomfort with what it would mean to turn off a pacemaker as relief of suffering. And I believe one of them even said turning off a pacemaker would be like smothering your father with a pillow. So I really want to get into the medical professional's role in this, because I think your books have much to teach doctors and nurses and other allied health professionals.
Thank you. And I also want to put in a plug for Sunita's book, which is right behind me over here. It's so beautiful, detailed look at what it's like inside the world of medicine and how it feels on a really granular level. What happened in my family was that my parents were highly educated. They had signed advance directives. They were extremely healthy for being in their late 70s. And my dad had a major stroke, which then devolved into near blindness, misery, vascular dementia, and just an absolutely miserable existence over 6.5 years, and total exhaustion for my mother, who was now like 120-hour-a-week caregiver. And 2 years into this process, he had a completely asymptomatic slow heartbeat, no problems related to it. It got picked up on a test, and there was treating the test as opposed to treating the person. In fact, there was treating the heartbeat of the person, not treating the whole person, and certainly not treating or looking at the whole family and the suffering involved in the whole family system. And in my opinion, once a devastating something happens like that, where you have full-time caregiving, the entire family and their suffering ought to be the patient and ought to be the focus. But that wasn't the case. It was just, can we fix this little thing on a graph? Pacemaker gets put in, 15-minute conversation. There was kind of a something that could happen to anybody, but my dad had a hernia. He couldn't get a cardiac clearance to have the hernia addressed unless he got the pacemaker in. So everybody felt like nobody was going to get sued. Okay. So it goes in with a 15-minute conversation with my mother. The family doctor is not involved. He thinks it's a terrible idea once he finds out it's already been done, in essence. And then my dad declines and declines and declines, and lo and behold, there's no exit plan. We, our highly educated family, have no knowledge of what our rights and non-rights are. Yep. I don't know that there's even a principle in medical ethics called patient autonomy. I didn't know that the Supreme Court in 1989 had said that you can request the withdrawal or simply refuse any medical treatment. You don't have to have a good justification for it. Mm-hmm. I had no idea where are the lines between patient autonomy and refusing and euthanasia. And in fact, I remember telling a very close friend of mine whom I love dearly, and I said, my mother and I got to the point where we wanted to get this thing turned off because my dad was suffering to an absolutely pointless degree. And my friend said to me, that's euthanasia. And she was Jewish. And so the whole feeling of what euthanasia means in our culture it's like there was no permission, that this society had a complete taboo against anybody saying, I've suffered enough, I've lived a good enough life, this is enough. No more hospitals, no more devices, no more prolonging what has become a horribly protracted experience of dying and helplessness, and is no longer life-saving in any way. And I feel our language is so distorting of our thinking that we even use terms like life support to describe this, or intensive care to describe what is really a technology-rich and relationship-poor environment in which people may be being saved, or it may be very effective, but people inside intensive care are not feeling cared for in the way that word means for the regular public.
Yeah.
I think our language alone almost traps our thinking. And I think all of us who are authors here are involved in this process of culturally trying to create a linguistic language where these thoughts can even be stated, and these questions and decisions can be even articulated in a way that makes sense. And that's why I applaud all of us, because we're pioneers into trying to create this new landscape for thinking and speaking.
And I'm definitely going to get into the language issue in just a couple minutes, because I think so much of as we've talked about, unnecessary suffering might be prevented if we all knew how to have these discussions, both with ourselves, our loved ones, and our medical professionals who are trying to take care of us and may not know how to start the conversations themselves. Shoshana, I want to turn to you, because you have, I think when I think about unnecessary suffering, and I think about what Katy just described about her mother's experience, I think caregivers to the sick, particularly the sick who are dying, there are kind of silent heroes, right? And you have been a caregiver. And I want to hear about your experience of caring for your father and the obstacles you encountered with the medical system, or with just the experience of being a caregiver, and how you used that experience to make your book so rich from a caregiving perspective.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And before I answer, I also want to give a plug to your book, because I feel like it's unfair that we're not asking you questions right now. And just to Katy's point about language, I heard you give a talk about the subtleties and nuances of language in the medical field, and the way that you have learned to talk to your patients, which was so beautiful at the Endwell conference. And everyone should go take a look at that recording. Endwell has all of the talks recorded online, and it's really stunning. Thank you for the question. You know, there's a silent army of 45 million caregivers in this country who are doing unsung work, and it's extremely hard work, as Katy knows, as BJ knows, as you know, Sunita. It's also work that bestows a lot of gifts and a lot of lessons about just living life and every other part of your life. So sitting with my father became a matter of me really changing my whole metabolic rate, my whole rate pace of how I show up in the world. It's like I had to synchronize to his time, which was very slow, very quiet, and had a completely different set of needs that I had never really experienced yet. And I'm a parent, so I'm used to the needs of a completely dependent newborn. And in some ways, the experience is quite similar when you're dealing with someone who's suffering, because you're doing a lot of very slow feeding, a lot of very slow cleaning, but regular cleaning. You have to bring a lot of tenderness to bear. And mostly you just have to kind of be there. You have to sit there and be patient and allow what ensues to ensue. And that is so hard for us busy humans who are who are used to the daily pace of multitasking, of, running from this to that. And so it takes an enormous discipline to slow down and just be there. That was a huge lesson for me just in life. When I could actually sit there with my father and just hold his hand on the couch and be quiet, it was the most meaningful time. And it was probably the most intimate time I had ever had with him, because who just sits on the couch with their father and holds his hand and is quiet? So in a way, it was a very beautiful and intimate experience. But it can be grueling. And I think the issue is that we're so used to hiring people to do things for us these days, right? We've outsourced nearly everything. And we no longer live in a time when we have to grow our own food, take care of our own families, where we live in homes where there's multiple generations there, and we learn how to take care of both the elderly and the young folk. And so we're out of practice. We just don't know how to do things for ourselves anymore and for the people in our world. And, I wouldn't wish having a hard caregiving experience on anyone. And yet I think it is an incredibly expansive, mind-expanding and soul-expanding experience once you go through it. Yep. So that's what it is. It's a 360-degree experience, like everything in life.
Yeah. And that's such a beautiful sentiment you point to, this idea of needing to slow down, to pace your life with the pace of somebody who is more dependent than they ever have been, right? And to attend to the emotions that come up with that experience. When you were talking about sitting on the couch and holding your dad's hand, I started to tear up, because you're right, it's such intimacy, and it's a particular sort of intimacy caring for our parents when they cared for us at the other end of life. So it is a gift, but it's also a gift that comes with costs, as Katy's mother's experience was. And you talked about that so beautifully in your first book, Katy, Knocking on Heaven's Door. I always love at these panels to hear authors read from their books, because I think you're going to give the audience an insight, not just into everything you're saying here, but how you actually put it into words that are beautiful and nuanced, and I have no doubt will help everyone in this audience and beyond. So, Shoshana, do you have a section of the book that you either feel is most important for the audience to hear, or was just the most fun to write?
Oh, wow. Well, those are two very different sections.
Another at the end.
Yeah. I have to go grab my book. I'm going to take you with me.
Oh, nice.
Maybe you can ask someone else a question while I grab a page in the book. Hold on one sec.
VJ, would you like to read a section that you would like? I guess we can start with what you most want readers to take away from your book. And there's so much in there. Feel free to read a sliver.
Okay. Well, gosh, the answer to what would I most want readers to take away from this book? That's a doozy. I guess it's sort of, there's no particular point except for this sort of meta message. I guess what I really hope is that one way or another, we've offered a bunch of on-ramps for people to forge some relationship to their ending, some relationship to their limitations, some relationships to their own death. You don't have to love it. You can hate it. You can fight it. I don't care what, just don't pretend it doesn't exist. I don't mean to sound so judgy. I mean, denial has its place. But I guess my hope, and back to what Katy was saying too, I think all four of us here are trying our best to participate in some mind shift with new language, new ways in, all that. So, amen. And so I guess that's my hope, is the takeaway would be that you or no longer surprised that you die. That would be my hope. But I'm going to read, I chose a check, like right now, boy, it seems like, there is, Katy, you're right on. We wrote our book too with chronic illness in mind and this protracted relationship to the end. And our current pandemic is uprooting some of those expectations. Some of the things still, the principles still hold, and some don't. But one of the big ones that holds is grief, is this overlay of grief. And for my money, it's sort of like, if I were to think of sort of one force, one muscle to exercise these days that will help us rewrite our ship, help us get through this, help us, find beauty in it too, while acknowledging the hardship, etc. It's really the muscle of grief. And we in the West haven't really done that very well. Generally speaking, we give you a couple weeks to grieve, and if you're sad beyond that, we call you depressed. And that is that's really a big shame for a number of reasons. But let me just shut up and start reading. So I'm just going to read this little chunk on anticipatory grief, because I don't know that a lot of people know that sometimes you grieve before you've actually lost the thing that you're grieving. And so it seems like an important thing to call out.
Absolutely.
All right. So grief may start earlier than you think. It's not uncommon for it to well up at the time of a diagnosis or when energy first begins to flag. We grieve for the losses we now realize are coming, as well as for the loss of innocence that happens at the moment illness is diagnosed. We grieve in anticipation of death. And we grieve all sorts of losses, not just the loss of life, loss of freedom, independence, roles, things, ideas, relationships, and bodily functions. Dealing with any diagnosis or ongoing illness or disability in ourselves or those we care about means facing a cascade of losses. In hospice work and in the hospital too, you get used to unprocessed grief popping up all over the place and in many forms. We see it in families finding fault with things over which they have some control instead of directing their anger at the disease, which is less satisfying to complain about, or requesting more voices in the mix until they hear the news they seek. We see it in patients or coworkers yelling at staff for no particular reason. We see it in our own weird mood swings. All these behaviors and more are grief's proxies. Grief is a shapeshifter and varies in intensity and form as it winds its way through a person. You can feel your insides wrestling with the loss, trying to reconcile the truth of what's gone with what remains. When confronted with death, grief may feel like a dream state, your mind and body a few steps behind the reality swirling around you. But grief in advance can be helpful too, as a kind of practice for what is to come. John had an aggressive type of leukemia, a cancer of the blood cells. After about a year of ups and downs since the original diagnosis, he and his wife Pamela were referred to palliative care. By the time we met, they'd endured a bone marrow transplant, which worked only briefly before his cancer returned. Gloom, hope, gloom. While John and Pamela began in earnest to prepare for death, waves of new treatments were coming to market, some of them specific to his subtype of cancer. Hope again. John was game, all the while working through his wishes and preparing for death to come soon. But it didn't. Treatment after treatment worked, each one for a short time. It was like watching someone swing from vines through the jungle, swooping from highs to lows to find another vine dangled just in time to keep him from falling. This was a modern medical story, the kind in which the line between chronic and terminal illness keeps moving. Both John and Pam became pros at hoping for the best while preparing for the worst, a way to hold conflicting outlooks all at once. But this process took its toll, most especially on Pamela. She had to be ready for his imminent death and protect his wishes, his appointments, the apartment, travel, social connections, contingency planning for worst-case scenarios, mixing their nightly Manhattans, all the while appreciating this extra time with him. The succession of surprising good news in extended time cast her into what she called no man's land. It was very hard to do, so our work turned primarily to her. In our appointments now, she was the patient, and John got to be the caregiver. It didn't feel safe for Pamela to let go of the idea that John's death was around the corner. So for the 2.5 years this lasted, she was grieving. Her grief was smoldering, subacute, underlying everything. At times she burst into exasperation, wanting all this to be over, and she'd say as much. But John understood and listened lovingly so that Pamela could find more strength, which she did. When the next new treatment on the list would have required an indefinite hospital stay, a big expense, and no nightly Manhattans, John said, no thanks. Barely 2 weeks after stopping that last treatment and 3 years after his terminal diagnosis, with Pamela and his children by his side, John finally died. Hospice was involved, but little help was needed by that point. They'd made it. Pamela and John were fortunate to be able to work through the grief together. By the time of John's death, it was a familiar companion, and Pamela was able to enter her official mourning with nothing but warm, deep sadness and a tinge of pride. She called it clean sorrow. I'll stop there. But, some of that may, again, we're here talking about an example of chronic illness, but I think the point here that's relevant is that grief doesn't watch the clock. It moves through you. It feels strange. It lasts over time. Even when you don't think you're grieving, you are. And the loss that you're grieving keeps moving around. Like right now, so many of us are going to survive this, but it doesn't necessarily feel like we are, either for ourselves or others. So one way or another, this surfing grief seems like a skill for the ages. And this is a little snippet of how one might do that.
And I love that phrase, clean sorrow, and the way that when we start at the time of somebody who's seriously ill but is not in the throes of active dying, you actually can help people prepare so much better than if you're called in at the 11th hour. And I definitely want to get to the situation around COVID. I think some of the grief I've seen on the front lines is that we can't let families or any visitors into the hospital. Mm-hmm. So patients are sitting alone, either in the intensive care unit with COVID or with something else, or on the floors, the non-ICU floors, where they're completely alone. And there is a certain grief that they experience and that their families experience that's very particular to this era, where they may only be able to see their loved one the way you and I are looking at each other now. So we'll come back to what COVID has done, but just what you were saying really made me reflect on at least some variations on grief that we're seeing in the hospital right now. Shoshana, why don't you read a passage from the book?
Okay. So this is kind of a nice dovetailing of everything you were just speaking about, Sunita, because I've also been thinking a lot about how isolated people are right now. And we bring all of this incredible technology to bear when we need to treat someone and fix them. And yet there's all of this enriching technology that we could use to help people feel less isolated that is very simple stuff, like having someone listen to an audio voice message of a loved one, of a family member in the ICU. They say that hearing is the last sense to go. Even if someone is not, conscious, the idea of holding up an audio recording of a loved one just saying, I'm here, I'm with you, you are with us. There's so much that could be done.
Yeah.
And one thing we did in the book was we sat with this lovely, what I call letter midwife named Frisch Brandt, who sat with patients at Zen Hospice and would have them compose what she called lasting letter to people in their family. It was really last words in a way, like I want to give you this gift of a message from me before I die. And we heard so much about the power of that. I mean, all of the people we admire who we had interviewed for this book, like Ira Byock, The 4 Things That Matter Most to Say to Someone. There's so much about just being able to communicate what is important. And so I've been thinking a lot about this too. You know, if I become sick and I'm isolated from my family, or if someone else in our family becomes sick, I want that instrument of communication to be there. So Frisch sat with us, and she had me compose a letter to my daughter in the book. And for me, it was an incredibly powerful experience, because you immediately believe that you're dying.
Yeah.
I'm not dying as far as I know, although we're all dying day by day. But the exercise of sitting down and thinking about what would Cleo need to hear from me if I couldn't communicate to her. So this is the letter that came out. Cleo, you are incredibly strong and can weather anything. In your life, there are likely going to be times when that strength is challenged. You may feel like the world is testing you, doubting you, perhaps doesn't see you the way you see yourself. Remember this: you are capable of anything. If you can see the world as a series of open doors rather than closed doors, there's nothing you can't do. I learned my bravery from my mother, who never heard the word no. A crazy matriarchal spirit comes through our line. There is art in there if you look for it. Your great-grandmother Paula could take any misshapen lump of clay and draw a spirit out. You will carry that forward. As a child, I felt like I was being chased, and you have that same fear. There is some value in that fear, because our time is not unlimited. And in a way, we are being chased by death and have like 5 minutes here. So do all you can do. Sometimes I felt like our family had a lot of strife. I worried about it. I worried about not modeling well what a loving family could look like. I hope you know how deeply your father and I love you. Cleo, we are on a small blue marble in the sky. Look up, and as all-consuming and overwhelming as life may feel, remember that we are just a small part of everything. Life is a really grand experiment, and I have no doubt that you're ready for it. I love you, Mom.
Second time you made me tear up. That was beautiful. And it was such an essential part of the book, because you show your vulnerability there and your openness. You make mention of things that are not easy to make mention of. But I think part of what it means to reflect on your life and to offer wisdom and love to somebody else means going to that vulnerable place, which I think is very difficult for people to do.
Thanks.
Katy, let's hear from you. Passage of the book that you would like people to take with them, and one that you feel like is the most important.
Well, to address that question that you asked BJ about what did you hope people would take away, I think for me it's something like trust your heart, trust your gut, reown your moral authority.
Yeah.
You actually know more than you think you know. And don't turn over your view of reality to other people who don't even know you or your family well, no matter how much technical knowledge they may have.
Yeah.
And I was going to read it, sort of an inspiring part from the front of the book, which is about people who contemplate and are willing to contemplate their aging and their vulnerability and their mortality tend to have better deaths than people who don't, who just try to shut it out. But then BJ read that such a beautiful thing about grief.
Yeah.
And the uncontrollable part of this, but that it no longer feels like the right fit.
Yeah.
So I thought if it would be okay with you, I would read one very short passage, and then a really beautiful end-of-life ceremony that was created by some oncology nurses, and one that can be applied to this new situation of not being able to touch necessarily who we love.
That sounds
so
good.
I wanted to start with, if I can find it here. Okay. So my book is divided into these time sections, and this is from a chapter called Preparing for a Good Death. Do not underestimate the power of your emotional legacy, expressed in even a small last-minute exchange. Kathy Doobie was raised on the East Coast by a violent alcoholic mother. She had no memory of ever hearing her mother say, "I love you." Kathy eventually moved to California, but the two women's relationship continued to be marked by bitterness, distrust, and estrangement. When Kathy was in her 40s, her mother developed breast cancer. A little more than a week before her death, she was admitted to the hospital. Over the phone, she told Kathy, "Don't come. I don't want to see you." Kathy got on a plane anyway, on the advice of a friend who told her that if she didn't, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Kathy walked into her mother's hospital room. There she found a tiny figure curled up in bed, shrunken, yellow, bald, bronzed by jaundice, as she later described it in a poem. This was the mother she had feared for so long. The two women looked at each other in silence. Kathy's mother said aloud, for the first time that Kathy could remember, "I love you. I'm sorry." That was it. Kathy replied, "I love you and I'm sorry." Those few moments, said Kathy, cleared up a lifetime of misunderstanding each other. And so I just feel the message from that for me is so much about how something that you think is small, like a small kindness to someone else or a single sentence, people take those single sentences and they make everything they need to out of that one sentence. Mm-hmm. So to not hold back, to have the courage to be vulnerable, to say that difficult thing or to express love, even in a very difficult relationship. And I certainly, none of us want to imply that everything gets tied up in a neat bow for everybody at the end of life, but there are these possibilities. And then I've been thinking a lot, during the Civil War, soldiers who were dying on the battlefield used to sometimes pull out photographs of their family members who were way back in the North, let's say, because that whole ritual of the family vigil, the vigil of actually staying and being with someone as they're dying, was so important. So they had a virtual version of it, just like a Zoom, a little postage. And I've noticed when I read this bathing and honoring practice that was created by oncology nurses to honor the dead in hospitals, people in my readings would often close their eyes, and then afterwards they would come up to me and said they had imagined doing it with the body of someone who had already died, and there had been, let's say, a chaotic or a distant, unsatisfying death. And I'm actually thinking of doing this on a Zoom, some meeting, I'm not sure what, but I'm thinking that one could do it and touch the parts of one's own body and feel and imagine that one is doing this for the body of someone that we loved. Because there's one chapter of my book, and a lot of it is about humanizing a hospital death, because 70% of people say they want to die at home, but only about half that number are likely to actually accomplish that. And so how do we bring sacredness and acceptance and presence and calm even to a death that is not occurring in the best of situations? Yep. And of course now these deaths are occurring in exactly the situation that I wrote my entire book to try to divert people from. An ICU death where people are fully gowned and clothed and look like they're in a spacesuit. So acknowledging the pain that exists, the grief that exists, that this is happening this way. So there were nurses at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. There was a change in the protocol of the hospital. so that instead of a funeral home coming in and handling the body quite reverently, they were now just being zipped into body bags and trundled down the back elevator. And these nurses were feeling intense moral distress as a result of what they were seeing because they were close to these patients. And this is the ceremony that they created. And I'm just going to encourage people to just touch their own body. They would wash and dress the body of the dead in clothes from home or a clean gown, and then take lavender oil and go through this ceremony. We honor Jane's hair, which the wind has played with. We honor her brow, the birthplace of her thoughts. We honor your eyes that have looked on us with love and viewed the beauty of the earth. We honor your nostrils, the gateway of breath. We honor your lips that have spoken truth. We honor your shoulders that bore burdens and strengths. We honor your heart that has loved us, the arms that embraced us, the hands that held our hands and did so many things in this life, the legs that carried you to places of new strength, the feet that walked your own path through life. We give thanks to the gifts you have given us in our lifetime. We give thanks for the memories we created together. We have been honored to be part of your life. I just think it's so beautiful, and that we're going to need to use our creativity and our imagination to find new ways to do these things that are so important, whether we have a specific religious background or none, that there's still a way to bring presence and calm and sacredness into these moments, and to address our own grief, as BJ said.
Yeah, that was such a beautiful part of the book, and the phrase that your hair that the wind has played with particularly stayed with me. And I think this ritual that you're talking about, I think we're living in a time where ritual is disrupted. Yeah. Right? Because people cannot be together if their loved one's in the hospital. Sometimes even arranging a funeral or cremation can be newly challenging in the context of COVID. And so we as human beings look to rituals as almost like a ceremony where we can explore and leave some of our most complex emotions. And I had so many questions about ritual for all of you, but I want to skip those because I want to get in our last 10 minutes into the issue of language. Because I think all of us have talked together, and you have written so beautifully in your books about how you start conversations, how we stop kind of linguistic manipulations that ultimately sanitize a conversation that can be really messy. And so, Katy, I know this is something you have explored in great depth, and we're definitely going to hear from you. BJ, I want to hear a little bit from you, being a physician. What did you notice about the language your colleagues were using in your training in the years leading up to being a palliative care physician? And do you think any sort of language has changed now with all of the great work you and many others have done to advance conversations and to advance the field of palliative care, which, let's face it, you and I have to do a lot of conversations that our colleagues have a tough time with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amen. I mean, the signs are all over the place once you sort of get hip to it, once your ears are primed. Sometimes it's just simple obfuscation. We use medical lingo as a separator, and it gives us physicians a little cover because the patient or family are like, they're kind of forced into a deference and trust because they have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Sometimes we perpetuate that with just unnecessarily complicated language. That's everywhere. But even more than that, it gets kind of shocking once you're tuned in. So one of my favorites is, or my favorite thing to hate, my least favorites is, so-and-so failed chemotherapy or they failed treatment. We say this.
Yeah.
That the patient actually had the temerity to fail the chemotherapy. I mean, it's just so ridiculously, obviously 180 degrees from what it should be, from the truth. I don't know why we do that one. That one's just a shocker. And then there's some more innocent ones that just get handed down because they're kind of habit. They lost their battle with cancer, or they lost, they succumbed or something like that. Implying, of course, that they failed, that the patient screwed up, and that the proof of their screw up is their death. And so these are some classic ways we just perpetuate this sense that death is the enemy. And if you go through it, it's you screwed up, like your own personal failing. It's all over the place. Yeah. So, and of course it probably reflects all of, medicine's made up of human beings. And human beings who may have not done their own homework to ponder their own mortality. And in some ways have spent so much time pushing back on mortality, pushing back on Mother Nature, that in some ways doctors and nurses and other clinicians who are around this subject ostensibly way more often than the general public, in some ways are less prepared because they're so far down the seduction that we can do something to upend this. So in some ways, doctors are charged with being this front line and should be the most sensitized to these things, but in some ways are the most numbed out.
Yes, absolutely. I've been in family meetings where people use terms like, he has a poor prognosis. Mm-hmm. And if I'm able to say, well, Dr. So-and-so, can you help us understand what that means in really concrete terms? And that's one that just left and right, in addition to people failing treatment, that it just drives me nuts, right? Mm-hmm. Shoshana, how about you? If there's a pearl that you've learned in terms of using more concise and honest language in having discussions about not just death and mortality, but what someone wants their life to look like, what's a pearl you can share with the audience?
Well, there are lots of pearls in this oyster. I was just thinking as BJ was speaking about another one that is a pet peeve of mine, do not resuscitate, which is like, who does not want to resuscitate their loved one? We all want to bring our loved ones back to life. The thing is that is an incredibly inaccurate way to frame it, because you're not necessarily bringing someone back to life. You are performing a fairly violent, medical measure that has very poor, very low results of allowing people to live in a way that they would choose to live. So there are reasons for optimism. That medical language is switching to allow natural death, which is a much more human-centered way to talk about that moment. And, I've been having these discussions with my mother, who's 78, who does not have an advanced healthcare directive. As you can imagine, that is real tough for me. And I've had multiple discussions with her, and trying to reframe some of that language and flesh it out and make it feel more human and more palliative has been helpful. Another thing, we often talk about, because this discussion is hard to have and it's really hard to talk to people are very fearful, is to find some side doors into this conversation. So for me, as a storyteller, it always moves through story. And when I sat down at first with my mother after having written this book and was like, look, we got to talk about some important stuff about the end of your life, she was like, getting up and leaving the table. And then I took a different approach, and I sat down with her one morning and I said, Mom, I feel like I don't know a whole lot about your early life. Would you tell me some stories about growing up in the Bronx and, what your childhood bedroom was like, and who was your first crush, and what was the first time you felt disappointed or lost? And then she was just off to the races. And, I hit record on my iPhone, and I now have hours of beautiful stories that I really didn't know before. And then once I had that, it was a way in for me to say, it's so important to me to know these stories. And now I would just love to hear from you. What's your vision for the rest of your life? You know, what would you like to do? What would you like to see? Where would you like to go?
Katy, I really kind of look up to you as the master of exploring how language can be either a tool if you use it right or an impediment if you don't use it right in these discussions. So I'd love to hear from you about what you've done to advance that part of our culture.
I included in The Art of Dying Well, oh dear, my connection is lost too? No, sorry, it's not. I included in The Art of Dying Well a glossary at the back because of exactly this thing. And again, I see it from the patient and family point of view, which is, I've been a reporter for 30 years. Surely I could understand all this and how easy it is to feel intimidated and lost and disempowered. And then I think people have one of two reactions. They either try to leap up and adopt all that language, which would be my approach, try to equalize the power again by pretending to talk like a doctor, or they just get shut down.
Yes.
To me, the one crucial change I would love to see is for medical people to make a difference between treatment and care. I have heard all kinds of palliative care board-certified people say it's time to withdraw care. Mm-hmm. And no family member is ever going to say, oh, sure, let's withdraw care from my mother. If we're talking about treatment or shifting, that's much more palatable.
Yeah.
And I think for lay people, for a layperson, care means nursing care, caring, loving, being careful. The implications are totally different. But for a medically trained person, any kind of, quote, therapy, including defibrillation, is called care. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's one way that medicine shoots itself in the foot repeatedly by that misuse or over general use of the word care.
Yeah.
The other ones, my favorite unfavorites are, we have more arrows in our quiver. Would you please explain that? And especially, I don't have a crystal ball. And I think I understand the impulse behind this, which is, oh my God, I'm being asked to provide a perfect prediction and I absolutely can't, which is true. But there's something about saying to someone, I don't have a crystal ball. The implications, you look at the meta behind that language, it's, oh, you're superstitious. You think I am a fortune teller. Well, I'm not. And so even though the intention's fine, I think it comes across as disempowering and condescending. Absolutely. And then my other favorite is multiple organ systems failure, which, as far as I can say, is mostly a euphemism for you are dying. And so many people on my slow medicine group, they will say, the kindest person to me was that nurse who pulled me aside in the ICU and said, your mother's systems are shutting down. And my challenge to medical people is, if you can go into the break room and say, she's circling the drain, will you please come to me and say, yes, your mother's in the house of cards. She's like a Humpty Dumpty at this point. Any little breeze could knock her over and she won't be able to come back. Can we find some language for when people get to the point where they go to the hospital and they come back worse every time, not better? Can we find some really simple Anglo-Saxon language? Virginia Woolf one of her books, she talks about, I need a little language such as lovers speak, words of one syllable. And I think when any family or person is in crisis or is faced with something enormous that was unexpected, our brains shut down. We have it's fight or flight. It's very, very black and white, closed down thinking. And we really do need a little language such as lovers speak. Few words and direct.
Yeah. And that's Oh, sorry.
I'd rather see someone say something hurtful that made the patient cry, that made the patient angry, but was truthful. You know, my brother's a truck driver who just has a high school education. And he said, I would rather have the ugly truth than a pretty lie.
And that's such a beautiful place to wrap up. If you hadn't said that quote from your brother, I would have definitely brought that up, because that is really what people want. You know, we want honest truths from our care providers, and we want honesty from our loved ones about what they really want, so we can be their voice. And I think all of your books complement each other so nicely in empowering people to have those discussions with their loved ones and ask the same questions of themselves and get guidance from their doctors. So I'm so appreciative that we got to do this and that we get to share your work with the world. Thanks for joining the conversation and the virtual Bay Area Book Festival.